If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, it would be greatly appreciated if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating. This helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. I'm your host, Andrew Pludger, and I'm a survivor of Bob Jones University. BJU is a fundamentalist college with its roots in white supremacy and is known for its culture of indoctrination, conformity, and control. Its influence extends beyond its campus, impacting Christian schooling, politics, biblical counseling, and evangelical Christianity. The school serves as a hub for churches, schools, and camps, and these institutions perpetrate its abusive teachings and practices. This show explores these areas of influence and amplifies the stories of those who have been impacted by Bob Jones University. This is Beyond BJU, Exposing Fundamentalism. Hello, everyone. I am so excited for you to hear this episode, and I'm excited because I got Erin Burchwell to record an episode for Beyond BJU, and there's just so much to her life. I mean, she grew up at Bob Jones University, and she ended up being interviewed for the Grace Report, and there's just so much to unpack there. And I said, you know what? I'm going to republish like your original interview, the whole one from Surviving BJU, and then I want to like get more into your experiences at Mount Calvary Church and also going on missions teams, because I'm sure there's so many more exciting stories and things that happened. So she really comes back on to share fun stories from the missions team and experiences at Mount Calvary Baptist Church. But enjoy this episode of Beyond BJU. Hello, everyone. I am so happy to have Erin Burchwell on Beyond BJU. I've been looking forward so much to talking again. Erin, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Of course. And for people who aren't familiar with you, could you do a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Erin Burchwell. My parents taught at Bob Jones for over 40 years each, and I grew up literally on the campus. We lived off campus, but running around the campus, running around Rhodehaver Auditorium for operas and rehearsals and fun things like that. I was born in 1979 off campus. Most of my friends were born on campus at Barge, but my mom had a heart condition, so I was born off campus, and I stayed there from my birth in 79 until I graduated from college in 2001.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I know on this episode, there's so much to dig into with like your life, and I'm hoping one day you'll write a memoir because there's just so much.
I'll have to get a writer, but sure.
There's just so much, and as I've listened to your other interviews, I was like, oh my gosh, like we could dig so much deeper and even go into different stories. But something I think an aspect we did not really get to cover that much, maybe we touched on a little bit, was like your experiences going on a missions team. And before you go into the stories, explain your mission or your parents' role with mission teams, what they did.
Sure. So from 1991 until I graduated in 2001, I went on a mission trip with my parents all across Eastern Europe. In the later years, we did more in Western as well. But the first year we took the team, it was still the Soviet Union over there. And we have some wild stories of who takes 27 college kids to the Soviet Union. And we have some wild stories. But my dad, he taught voice, singing, choir. A lot of people recognize him because he led the singing in chapel. My mom was in the Shakespeare English department, later the speech department. And in, I think, 1990, Dr. Bob III approached my dad about the Christian. We'd been praying at school at Bob Jones for the Christians in Russia, the persecuted Christians, and a lot of Southern Baptists were going into Russia at that time, but not really anybody in the tight fundamental circles. And so Dr. Bob wanted to send a team over there. We asked my dad to figure it out. My mom and dad somehow figured out how to rent 3 Peugeot vans in France, drive all the way to St. Petersburg back when it was still Soviet Union. And I have a lot of great memories from those travels. For one thing, it wasn't in Greenville. It was out in the world, but we had a lot of really great adventures and a lot of friendships were made. Friends I still have. A lot of people met and fell in love on the team where you weren't supposed to date on the team. That was a rule, but a lot of them got married and a lot of them are still on the mission field over in Europe to this day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And what were some stories that you wanted to share? I'm sure you have so many, but what were some of the main ones you wanted to share?
I think, oh man, okay. I think the most shocking one involved the Italian mafia. And my mom, she documented everything, and I'm going through their house now, and I'm finding all kinds of photos and fun memories that I thought, how did I forget that? So we were in a part of Italy that was very Catholic and very mafia run. I think it was 1997. And we drove in 3 vans that were nice, but they were rentals. And we were at this missionary church. And there was some backstory. I don't remember all of it about the Catholic Church was not happy that we were coming and doing Bible services. And they were somehow involved with the mafia. In the middle of the night, one night, they stole our 3 vans. And at that time, they were using them as like they were taking seats out and transporting drugs back then. And they would ship the cars then over to Albania, like on a boat, and you would never see them again. So we wake up on a Sunday morning and somebody goes out to get something out of the van. And they're like, who took all 3 vans? I think they maybe sold 2 of the 3. And long story short, the neighbor child had seen who did it. It was someone in the town. And the person saw the child in the window and was like, and they killed their dog and hung it in a tree. And so I just remember because I had traveled a lot, even though I was still like maybe high school then, my parents were in charge. And I would follow them sometimes, whereas everybody else was told to stay inside. And so my mom was outside filling out a police report and I go nosing around and I see this dog and she's, don't you tell anyone, don't tell anyone, they're going to be calling their parents. So I had to go back and not tell anybody, but yeah, it was a miracle. We got them back. They miraculously found them. I think they were not able to be repaired. So the rental company gave us new ones, but that was a wild story. And because of all the attention in the town and the fact that we were able to miraculously find the vehicles, a lot of people came and visited, including some of the police officers. They came to services and it was really neat in the end. But
Oh, wow.
yeah, that's one of the more wild ones. Border crossings were always wild times. Back in the day, the line of cars would go miles and people would be there for weeks. Once there was a German bus that somebody had a heart attack and died on the bus, and the bus sat there with everyone on it for 2 days. And we drove right past it. As Americans, we would cut to the front of the line. So we had a lot of wild stories like that. Once we had to sleep on the side of the road in the van. So it was very different from it was strict with dress standards and things, but it was not on campus strict. So it was a lot more fun than being on campus, for sure.
Yeah, you didn't have that whole system of control all around
Right.
you, Bob
Right.
Jones University, all the mechanisms in
Right.
place. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm
and
trying
then
to think.
I'm curious, like, how would they prepare you to go on these trips? Because I'm sure there is some way that they set some kind of guidelines or expectations or maybe trainings, or what was that like?
If you made the team, you auditioned, you had to be able to carry a tune. And if you made the team, it was a choir, I think 4 sopranos, 4 altos, etc. And there were always like 4 brass players and a piano, and it was a portable piano. And the theory was you rehearse during the year and then go and you could stand on a street corner and with the brass and our keyboard play or sing a cappella. So we would go into Eastern European cathedrals, like Orthodox cathedrals. And we would sing, and it was so beautiful, and it would attract attention, and we would pass out tracts, of course, and also New Testaments. Our first year in the Soviet Union, people did not have copies of the Bible, and the church had to limit it. They had to show their passport, and they had to limit it to one New Testament per household, because people were just like grabbing them out of the boxes. And it was a neat experience, that one was. So the choir singing is what got us into venues. So then the missionaries we were visiting could help get visitors into their churches. So we would give concerts all across Europe.
I see. And so what were some other stories that you remembered?
When I was young, probably 7th grade, we were in Romania, Romania and Ukraine, I think, were the poorest countries. Belarus was close behind it, but we stayed next door to a state-run Romanian orphanage. And because I was still a kid, I got to go in, and whereas they wouldn't have let another American in. And so I got to see, it was really sad. All the kids that were young had their heads shaved because of lice. The lice was so bad. I wound up getting a really strange case of head lice and bringing it back to the United States. I remember the clinic at Bob Jones, they were like, hey, can we show another nurse like these lice, because they're huge? But it really put a lot of things in perspective. And from a religious standpoint, it was really neat to see that people that don't speak your language believe, in a higher power as well. And the Russian Christians, they would give us all the food that the Germans would give them for humanitarian aid. They would feed us, and you had to eat everything that was put before you, because it was really offensive in Eastern Europe if you didn't. And we had some really interesting meals. Like once there was a stomach bug that went through the group, and it was like a violent one. And out of 27 people, I think 21 people got it within 2 days. And so we were about to do the whole long drive across Poland and then the border crossing into Belarus. So my parents said, if one more person gets sick in the night, we were in this nice German hotel. If one more person gets sick, we're going to stay here, we'll delay a few things and get better. So that night, of course, I was in high school. I start violently vomiting. And I don't want to, that's probably too graphic, but I'm on the floor of this beautiful marble bathroom. And I'm like, thank you. Because it was never my favorite going into the real rough countries, because I did it every summer. And I was like, oh, thank you, Lord. And so in the morning, they're like, did anyone get sick? And they're like, Erin did it. And they're like, that doesn't count. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean it doesn't count? So the whole way across Poland, I had a trash bag and a van full of people. And then when we got towards Belarus, my mom's like, oh, look sick, sit up. They're going to quarantine you. Russia, he looks sick. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I could tell stories all day about that trip.
Okay. And yeah. And so what ages did you go on these?
So I was 11.
trips?
My sister was 9 the first year. And then I did it until I was 21.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That's a lot. Okay. So what are some other stories?
Oh gosh. We had we loved to play practical jokes, because we were in college. I was in high school, and you'd do anything to have fun. And so we had to stay in Russia it was an abandoned orphanage. They have showers way down the hall and communal showers. But anyway, somebody put a Kool-Aid packet in the shower head that was red, the good old 90s tricks, 80s tricks. And I just remember a huge fight breaking out the next day over whether it was spiritual to joke around or not. And this was a serious trip, and it became it was like Kool-Aid gate. And we would sit at these very long tables, and they put the food down the middle, like sandwich type finger foods. And they would always put dessert, and everyone would try to grab for the good desserts first. So when I was young, I had something called extending fork. It was a fork that would go like 4 feet. And so we would steal like the good desserts down there. Anything to break up the same old. We did go very near Chernobyl a couple times. And one of the times they fed us fish. And my husband jokes to this day, that's what's wrong with me. You ate fish by Chernobyl when you were still like growing. That's what's wrong with you. But yeah, just so many. I'm trying to think of some other funny stories. Man, once in Hungary, someone played a joke and we were going to get her back. So we gathered a ton of these stink bugs and put them in her suitcase. And that probably was going too far, but it was funny and she did laugh. But anyways, yeah, we had a lot of fun times like that. There were also a lot of not fun times too.
And then what was a typical schedule like when y'all were on these mission teams?
It was a lot of work. We would only stay in one place for 2 nights, 3 nights maybe. So it was a lot of driving. We filmed entire movies in the van with, camcorders, because we would write a script, because sometimes you would be in the van for 14 hours a day. And so one time we were driving through Russia, and the Russians love to pull over nice looking cars because they knew you were foreigners and they knew you'd probably give them cash to not ticket or whatever. So they pulled us over all the time. And one time they pulled us over and they made us pay a tax because our vehicles were loud and they scared the animals. So they would just make up tax as they went along. It's like Gilbert and Sullivan. So we filmed a whole movie. We had a little anteater, like a Beanie Baby anteater, and we filmed a whole movie about scaring the Russian wildlife, which we never saw any wildlife except really large mosquitoes. Yeah, outhouses. That was really fun in the middle of the night. Yeah. And we would go when we were in, schedule. So when we were in Eastern Europe, a lot of places we stayed did not have running water or anything. So you would go a while without anything but a sink. But it was almost every day, and sometimes multiple times a day, especially on Sunday, we would do like a 2-hour concert. They were just benches or in the woods a lot of times. And so it was long. Sometimes Sunday services went up to 4 hours long. And yeah, so it was a lot of driving, a lot of traveling, and then a lot of singing. And it was hard if you got sick, because then you couldn't catch up there was no time to rest in between.
I see. Yeah. Before we move on to the next subject, are there any other stories you would like to share?
No, I can't think of anything.
I heard your interview, the second interview you did on the indoctrination, and I was just like blown away just by some of the stories that you shared about just Barge Hospital that you've heard. Would you mind sharing some of those?
Yes, Barge. So part of your package, if you taught at the school, if you were faculty staff, was medical was provided. There were only 2 to 3 doctors at any time for all of the 5,000 plus students, several hundred faculty, etc. The doctors were overworked, underpaid as well. They had to abide by all the standards, and they had like a hospital on campus. A lot of people didn't know, which is shocking to me, because growing up, I just always knew that they had surgeries there. And they didn't even do it on a floor that was quiet. It was on the second floor, which is where the pharmacy was. So your healthcare was provided, but you had to go to Barge Hospital on campus, or the clinic, which was on back campus, I think, and then moved across the street. But if you were pregnant and you had a baby, you had to have it at Barge I would say most of the time, or much of the time. As far as I remember, there was no anesthesiologist. So
that's what I was going to ask. So they had to do a natural birth, didn't they?
Yeah, they may have given them pain meds, some of them, but I do know of one particular story where the woman labored for way too long, and then they were like, and didn't have any medicine, and they put her in a wheelchair, drove her downtown. She had a C-section, and then she came back and recovered with Tylenol. I don't know her personally, but I know who she is, and I know other people who did not have epidurals at all when they were having a baby there. As a kid once, I remember my mom was there to get some medicine at the pharmacy that was also on that second floor. And the pharmacist knew everything everyone was taking. And he would sometimes argue with my mom about sleeping pills in front of everybody. We were playing in the lobby, waiting around for something to be filled probably. And this nurse comes running down the call. Stop, be quiet. There's a surgery happening. And I'm like, it's not a soundproof room. It's just happening right there. And if you were sick as a student, you couldn't stay in your room. You had to check into Barge. So people had to be really sick nobody wanted to stay there. When you were there every day, they piped in chapel really loud. Didn't matter. You could be passing a kidney stone. It didn't matter. The chapel came on and they would come in, and it wasn't a pleasant experience. So a lot of people avoided Barge.
And yeah, so basically, if you were sick, you could not go to your dorm if you wanted to. If it was a cold and you wanted to just finish it there, it wasn't super serious, so you
No.
had to
Yeah.
go to Barge.
And if they didn't think you were sick, then they would just send you back if you didn't have a fever but really I knew very few people who wanted to go there. Now there was Licegate once. That did happen. Lice went around to a lot of people. And I distinctly remember an administrator in chapel getting up. The third floor of Barge turned into a nursing home, quasi nursing home, because when the older faculty were retiring, this was before healthcare got so expensive. They put them on the third floor, and cradle to grave is what Dr. Bob Sr. said. We'll take care of you from cradle to grave. The faculty were taken care of when they couldn't take care of themselves. The third floor, there was only second and third. The basement was the other floor. So third floor filled it up with a lot of older people and became a quasi nursing home for a while. But the one row of it once when I was in college was all these girls that had head lice. And it was like it was difficult to get rid of. I don't know why, but I remember my cousin's boyfriend worked at the dry cleaners that was on campus, and they would make him wear a hairnet and gloves and double bag the sheets. And I knew personally, I had a relative that had a head lice, and I knew another administrator's daughter up there because I went up to visit someone on the third floor and saw all these girls running around. And I'm like, they're not sick. And then this administrator gets up in chapel. He got very angry because they had what they would call Michigan or Ohio days, where a bunch of Ohio and Michigan schools would come down to visit. And some big block canceled their visit because of the lice rumors. So I remember an administrator got up in chapel and talked about gossip. And there is one case. He said, there's one case of head lice. And I remember going, wait, it was one of those moments where I thought, now I know that's not true. You've been gaslit your whole life, and you go, I know two people personally. And in fact, one of the people was an administrator's daughter sitting on the platform who's sitting there nodding his head. And I thought, how could you not know that and so we were all instructed to not talk about it anymore because there was only one case of lice. It's
Oh,
making my head
wow.
itch right now just talking.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those stories. And I was always so curious about Barge Hospital when I was there because I arrived in 2018 and it was closed. I'm not exactly sure. From what I've talked with other people, it sounds like it was at least closed by maybe around 2010, I think, or maybe a little earlier before that.
Mm-hmm.
They would do the grab and go like lunch by that every day, but in the Davis Field House. We would line up. It was outside of Barge. We would be heading into the Davis Field House, the gym area where they would have in the lobby the line, and then you go on the line and you would walk back along the sidewalk that was beside Barge. And I always looked at it. I was like, that place, I always knew it was closed. I didn't hear anyone talk about it, but I'm like, that's so interesting. I'm like, I wonder what has happened in there. And I got an opportunity to actually go inside of Barge. I think I can't remember what year, maybe sophomore-ish or maybe it was junior. But anyways, so one of the years I was there, I was taking a photojournalism class. We would usually get typical things that were going on campus. We would go to a sports game, or we would like get pictures of people on the dining common eating or whatever. And then there was like an opportunity for a class period. The teacher was like, all right, everyone. I think it was like the sheriff department or the police, like one of those people. But anyways, law enforcement. Apparently, Bob Jones still uses the building just to let these police officers train dogs to find drugs. They would plant these drugs throughout the building and the dogs would find it. And so I was so excited when the teacher said, yeah, we're getting in bars today. It's closed, but they only open it up for these certain things like this. And I was like, all right, we're getting into bars. And I remember walking in. So this was like the entrance that was at the side, like towards the, I guess I would say like south end of it, that was towards the girls' dormitories. And
What floor do you remember? Were you in the basement or?
I guess it was like the very first. It could have went deeper, but it was the very first floor that I was aware of. There could have been a deeper basement area, but the ground level floor, I guess I would call it. And we walk in, and it's very musty. The hall is trashed.
Ugh. For the
And
dogs.
there's like this kitchen area that's like such a mess. And I was just surprised. I was surprised because I was like, at Bob Jones University, they're all about keeping up this clean appearance. They're so hard on us on keeping all of our, like, our rooms are checked just about every day to keep clean.
Yep.
And that's associated with spirituality. Like how
Yep.
clean your room was, like associated with how spiritual or good
And the
the
grounds, like the
person.
immaculate plants and everything. In fact,
Don't step on the grass.
and no weeds. But in fact, I thought one of the other big flags, oh, they're in serious trouble, was when they had faculty doing yard work this year, and it didn't look good. And I'm like, whoa, if they're letting that go, that's not a great sign. That's interesting that they did that. That's
Yeah,
just interesting.
and
It's not like them at all.
it was so strange. And then we probably took pictures for about like 30-ish, 40 minutes of the dogs doing these things on this one floor. And they were about to leave. And I asked the teacher, I was like, could we explore? We have 15 minutes of class left. Could we use this time to explore, get some pictures of the bar? She's okay, that's fine. To just be back in around 15 minutes, and then we'll all leave the building. And so I think I remember going up to the second floor, and this might have been the pharmacy area because you went to this like desk, and then there was a shelf, and then behind that shelf
Yes, that's the farm. And it's farther, it's closer to the gym
it
side.
is, yes.
Yeah, that was the old pharmacy.
Okay.
That was gone before. Yeah, that they switched to a different pharmacy a long time ago. But yeah, that was the pharmacy.
Yeah, and so I remember walking in there and just imagine I think it was like the fake ficus plants, like there were fake
Oh,
ficus plants that were just fallen over,
let me
covered
tell
in
you, there's
cobwebs.
never a reason for a ficus. Never.
And I was just shocked with how trashed all the rooms were, just all these things that were still left in there. And
It's odd for them.
it was so strange. And I remember there's some stains on walls in some of the rooms.
All the buildings have struggled with bad mold. It's the South. And I can only imagine like what the mold in there is. It's South Carolina. It's musty. I thought of two other quick barge stories I haven't really thought about in a while. So, I talked about how you didn't have sick days as faculty. You taught. And again, some of this was growing up in the 80s too. But if your child was sick with a fever, then and you were faculty or staff, you went to the third floor. There was a room called the sick nursery, and you stayed with all the other sick kids in this nursery so that your parents could teach. And I remember my parents, because my dad taught voice, they would try to stagger their classes so that we didn't have to go to the sick nursery a lot. But that, yeah, the sick nursery was not, it was dark, and there were like cots and not a great place. And then my mom had cancer a second time after I graduated from college. And in the real world, when you have a technician x-ray you or draw blood, they don't comment on what they're seeing because they're not radiologists or doctors. My mom had a chest x-ray, and there was something on it that this Bob Jones nurse thought she saw. So she told my mom the cancer was in her lungs. And I remember exactly where I was when my mom called me, and she was like, it's over. And like, I pulled the car over and cried a little, and we were all like saying our goodbyes. And then the radiologist got back with her a few days, and he's, no, that's just a shadow. That's not anything. And so, and that was probably 2005.
Oh my God.
No. Yeah. 2005 when that one happened. So yeah, all kinds of wow.
Yes. Oh,
and now they're expunging records, and by law, I think you only have to keep records 10 years. So I asked, and mine are gone. I've been gone a long time, but people are trying to scramble and get theirs. And they kept track of you as a faculty kid with every record, like everything was kept in a file on you medically.
But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I know there were some other things you wanted to dig into, and I was so grateful we were able to meet in person earlier. Back, was it September?
All is running together.
Is it? I think it was September. I think originally it was supposed to be August, and then it moved to September. Anyways, so yeah, so like I enjoyed meeting you and getting to dig through your parents' files
Yeah,
and
there's a
finding
lot to
so
dig through.
many
And
interesting.
I have a ton of interesting letters. My mom saved everything, and I have a ton of really crazy letters from Dr. Bob III. And there's a funny story here too. People from the 70s, maybe early 80s might remember this story. We'll call it Choirgate, but I've got the correspondence for that. So my dad had a choir. There were 4 choirs, maybe 5 at one time, and it was also a fun time, but politics. And they would rotate who sang on Sunday morning mass, we called it. So it used to be that all faculty and staff and students had to attend this church service in FMA. They played the organ, and everyone wore robes like the Anglican church that was on the platform. And it was very formal. For many years, women had to wear hats, but people dressed up, and then you went and had the only good meal of the week in the dining room. And a choir would rotate every month and you'd sing. So my dad picked a song that was apparently too modern in its taste. And Dr. Bob III, there were a lot of visitors from somewhere that morning. So he gets up, he's supposed to be preaching, and he goes off on the song and who picked the song, which was my dad sitting there. And I mean, he goes off for several minutes. And then he wrote these really awful letters to my dad talking about how he says, I finally ran out of patience and told Dr. Gustafson, that was the head of the fine arts for many years, in a memo several weeks ago that I had done all I could do to register my complaints, and that while it seemed to me the music faculty did better for a little while after each of my objections, they had relapses. And if they could not understand this kind of music we wanted in services and on Vespers, the next time I heard something which was out of line, I was going to make a public statement about it. Anyway, that's not the... Here, let me find that's probably not a great quote. Hold on. Here we go. Remember, it was just a little too modern for his taste. There was nothing theologically wrong or musically wrong with it. This is to my dad. We cannot have the spirit quenched by music that is high church, dissonant, avant-garde, or dead, static, and unmelodic. This is a long letter. If I had not made that statement publicly, there would have been hundreds of visitors who would have gone away with a terrible impression of our music program and with reservation in their heart about the spiritual life of the campus. I had no choice. For their sakes, and also because I had told Dr. Gustafson that the next time such a disclaimer would have to be made. I'm sure my criticism was offensive to you, Bill, especially because I had not personally talked with you about this before. But I had talked to Dr. Gustafson and expected my complaints to be made known to the faculty. I think, Bill, in closing, this has been a good learning experience, and we will see an improvement. You're certainly not the only offender. And then there's a whole nother letter. Same stuff. And this was like, it was scary. It was very scary for my dad because he could get axed. All these letters, 1 or 2 letters, they don't mean anything. People can fire off nasty emails or letters, but the summation of what I have, correspondence from Dr. Bob III, it shows how angry he was, how rash he was. He would make these decisions just with an iron fist, and he even says in some of these letters, you're my good friend, then don't do that. But it's almost like that. It's gaslighting is not the right term, but like an abuser compliments you. We're friends and you're so good at music. That's why I've come down hard on you. And it was abusive relationship. And everybody lived in the shadow of, oh no, he's going to go off. Dr. Bob Jr. was not known for that. Dr. Bob Sr., I didn't hear as many stories about that, but Dr. Bob III was always this way. And again, over a modern piece of music. Anything could blow up into a massive deal. And that could be what you're wearing, your countenance, the song choice. Anything could mar your testimony for good. And so you lived in this constant fear. I told Rachel on the podcast, it's like a bad Groundhog Day. So most people get up in the morning and they're like, it's a new start. And at least for me, when I would get up, it was like, oh no, please, Lord, don't help me mess up today. This could be the day that I mess up so badly, I can't come back from it. And then by the end of the day, you're like, oh, I haven't gotten kicked out. I haven't lost my college degree yet. And then you start the cycle over. I did, afraid. But it's just, I'll obviously give you copies of these, but I found a ton of interesting stuff like this.
And where did you find these letters?
My mom kept files. My parents, they taught for more than 40 years each there, and they were controversial figures. I am well aware that they did not always play by the rules or get along with people, but a lot of students really liked, especially my dad, just because they had kids over to the house. Like my mom would make pumpkin bread for choir, little things that meant a lot to students who were living in the dorms and didn't have a car to go anywhere. And so a lot of students really liked my dad. And I think that ticked off some of the people in the music department, especially at least back in the 80s. But they both gave 40 plus years of their lives to Bob Jones. And in the end, there were power plays in the fine arts department, and who knows what else was at play. And they fired my dad. Just coincidentally, it was right at the same time that the Grace report came out, and I spoke to the news, but they said that didn't have anything to do with it. But they let him go, and they said he had a bad attitude when he was fired. So he was called back in the last week of school. He fell and broke his shoulder or his elbow, had surgery. He got called in by the head of the department his last week there, having been fired, and was confronted for having a bad attitude. And the man asked, "Would you like me to pray with you?" And my dad said no, and he got up and walked out, according to my dad. So they make a big deal in the fine arts department when someone who's been there that long and has been in operas and Shakespeare play, and he used to direct all the operas. They make a big deal and have a retirement party and show pictures. He got a card. He got nothing because he had a bad attitude when he was fired. My mom got a really small reception, but all that to say, my parents had this huge church. My dad was a choir minister there for also 30 years. When they fell ill and I moved them here to Ohio, a couple people have called them faculty, but no one faculty has come up here to visit them. No one from the church they gave their lives to has come up here to visit them. They've been up here 2.5 years. I have to struggle to get any of them to even call or email my mom. They literally, if you leave on the wrong terms, everything you did before it doesn't matter anymore. Or if you tick off the wrong person. And so everybody lives in this fear and this anxiety and this paranoia at all times, because again, you give a combined 85 plus years of your life, and here you are in Ohio and no one cares. They're gone. They're absolutely gone. A few mission team members have made trips to see them, but where are the faculty? Where are the people from their church? The church still sends them a bulletin which asks for money for missionaries in the nursing home, but they have abandoned them. And I don't really care what he did. You got to look at the years he gave, and nobody did.
And I remember you telling your story, and it was so mind-blowing to me was like, when you were there at Bob Jones with your parents, is how you couldn't have side jobs. Like, they isolated you so much from society and kept you so dependent in this isolated community. And that's the thing with high control groups, is they purposely set it up this way to keep you dependent. They make it purposely difficult to leave, and they provide everything you need right there.
My parents somehow got permission a few times to teach night school, and I have a lot of letters between her and the head of the department at the time, just back and forth about, we gave you permission to do this, but never again. They would make little exceptions, but even I know someone once that was in the military, and at one point he got called in. He was also a teacher, but he was not on active duty. And they basically told him that he needed to give his salary back to the school because he wasn't allowed to have a side job. Crazy things like that. To quote Jon Stewart, I heard him recently in a different context, but your actions are antithetical to the values you espouse. And not taking care of people who gave their entire lives, that goes against everything in scripture about taking care of people when they're old and helping the weak, people who've been abused, and they don't practice that. They may go rake leaves off campus somewhere, but they're not practicing true love, like they say they believe the Bible tells them that they're not practicing.
And I know there were some other stories you wanted to share. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to share with the letters, or do you want to move on from that?
Oh, I do have one that is really interesting. So my parents did a lot during the school year too with their mission team. They helped, some graduates went and were missionaries in countries that we would visit, and they would occasionally ask the school, could you provide some money for this school here and there? And a lot of the letters were, no, we don't do that. But every now and then, Dr. Bob would say yes to something. And so sometimes my parents, it looked like they would just converse with him to update him on what was going on. And he wrote in this one letter, I just think it's really interesting about the culture. It's dated 94. Thank you for your note. I wish my feelings about a girl replacing him were more positive. I don't see how a girl can have the effect in a church that a boy could, who could serve as youth director. She can teach English, and that's fine. Of course, that's better than nothing. It's between her and her parents. It's really none of my business. But again, it points to how women are viewed and treated just in general. Just interesting.
Yeah. And like something, this might be on the spot kind of question. Your parents looked up to all the Joneses, but what were your thoughts? And obviously Bob Jones Sr., but just from what you've heard, what are your thoughts on just all the Joneses, like Bob Jones Sr., Jr., the third, their family? What are your opinions on them or feelings?
My parents had a great, and they loved Dr. Bob Jones Jr., and he was very talented. As a kid once, my friend and I were backstage of Rodehaver during an opera because my dad was directing the opera, and he told us to go. I don't remember why we were backstage at intermission, but he told us to wait back there. And Dr. Bob Jones Jr. during performances would often walk around backstage and say hello to the actors. And I growing up, had a positive reaction to him. We were very young, and he saw us in the green room, and he didn't know that my dad was the director. And he's like, girls, and he yelled at us for being back there, and he terrified us. But I didn't have a bad impression of him. Here's one little weird thing that happened when he passed away, and they had the viewing in War Memorial Chapel. It was a little weird because they gave us the day off classes to go like walk through the open casket and say hi to the family. It was almost like the king had died or something, a royal funeral. But we were all grateful to get the day off. They buried him. And this is another weird thing that just screams to me cold. The Joneses are buried on campus in the middle of this fountain in the they call it the Bridge of Nations. Then I had to go back on campus late, and I was in college, and I had my parents' faculty sticker so I could come and go off campus at any time. And I had a key to the Fine Arts building, which I probably wasn't supposed to have. But I went to get something for a project. And when I got in my car, they had rented these cranes with these very bright lights that were shining over where they had buried him. So they had the whole casket in this concrete, whatever. It was dangling in the air on a crane, and they were doing, I don't know. And my mind is like, why did they pull him back out of the ground? Did they put him in for show, or did they want to get, I don't know, a piece of jewelry off? I don't know, but it was before cell phones and cameras. So I don't have any photo evidence of it, but it was just another weird thing it was secretive. It was at night. What is going on? But yeah, so I had a positive view of him. It was just Dr. Bob the third was just he just seemed so immature and rash, and the faculty knew it, and they all tiptoed around him. But he was very nice to me growing up, and he knew all the faculty kids' names. Even after I graduated, he knew my name when he visited the church we were in up here. I used to work at a bakery called Stroessner's, and Dr. Bob Jones Jr. and third, they live on campus, and they would throw out their banana cream and chocolate cream pies like every other day. So I would take a banana cream pie to Dr. Bob Jones Jr. and I think Dr. Bob III liked chocolate. But anyway, so I would just leave it at their door, and they were always really very nice. But then when my dad got fired and it all went down from there, and then the promise was taken away, and you as an adult start to look back and say, wait a minute, this is not right how this has all been handled. And again, I have never heard him apologize. He may have apologized for something. I've never heard him apologize. And he doesn't engage with people like me at all.
And then what other stories did you want to share? And I know there was something about being bullied by pastors you had mentioned
Yeah.
before we recorded.
Yes. So my situation that's documented now everywhere on the internet and in the New York Times article and in a Al Jazeera article, etc. I was made by the church to sign essentially an NDA saying I would never talk about what this guy had done to me or what we had mutually done together. And I was not allowed to talk about it. So his family also threatened to sue us multiple times, wrote scary anonymous letters in the mail. One of them had a photo of my head cut out hanging on gallows with a reference to Haman made his own gallows. And it's a long story because I was afraid to talk about it. I was afraid that I'd be church disciplined. I was afraid that the school would get me in trouble. I was afraid that his parents would sue us. I didn't know. We didn't know. We didn't have money to hire a lawyer. So I didn't talk about it. 10 years later, the Grace report comes out and I speak up to the news because they fired Grace. And this guy is a pastor in the Greenville area now and has a lot of really loyal friends who are also pastors, most of them, the ones I'm thinking about. They got very upset that I talked to the Grace report. The Grace report, it was a report that came out on Bob Jones, how they had handled sexual assault allegations over the years. And it was a third party that wrote, did they handle this? Did they not? When the Grace report happens, you give your story and then they call the offender, and they called his church and left a message, and they called, I think, his cell twice. And they give them a chance to say, what's your side? And he chose to not give a side. But that tipped off his friends that I had talked because it was supposed to be anonymous. And then they fired Grace. One of his pastor friends got together with some other pastor friends and they went around. I had been out of college for more than 10 years at this point. So had they. They went around and contacted some of my friends from college and said, how many people did she make out with? Did she ever talk about this incident? Because if she didn't talk about it, then it didn't happen because she talked to you. And then asked them if they would be willing to testify in court. So I don't know what they had planned, but it's just bullying is what it is. It's trying to scare me into not talking again all these years later. And this also I didn't name him. I have published the document that everyone signed, but it's not like I'm broadcasting his name or his church. These guys, they bond together, and it's bullying is what it is. It's adult bullying.
Yes, it most definitely is. And yeah, that's just...
And
so,
honestly,
yeah,
they've never talked to me. They've never asked me my side of the story. It's just, this is our guy and we're going to stick with him no matter what.
Yeah, and I remember talking with Eric Swarzinski on the Surviving BJU podcast of like how like the predators are always protected in these environments, and they just don't do the right thing when it comes to this area at all, and it's just caused so much more harm. And if these environments would have done the right thing, we wouldn't have all these different documentaries that are coming out about all these different places.
Right.
Like,
And
this is being released in 2024. Last year, we had Shiny Happy People. We had that covered Bill Gothard, the Institute of Basic Life Principles, and then Eric was a part of the documentary Let Us Pray, a Ministry of Scandals, which covered the independent fundamental Baptist movement. And it's if people would have done the right thing, it wouldn't have gotten to that point.
And I go way back to if this guy had he apologized to me several times and I have it in writing. But when it came down, when he got caught by the school, he would not say he was sorry. And honestly, if he had just said, I was wrong, I'm sorry, it wouldn't have been this big of a thing. And I probably would not have taken the time to fly down and talk to Grace. But his parents trying to silence me, the school trying to punish me, my church, if he had just said he was sorry, and then even at the Grace report, if the school had just said, we're sorry, we're going to make a few of the changes, I don't think it would still be coming up for a lot of people. But they're not going to say they're sorry. They never have. And Pettit really shocked everyone when he did apologize and said, if we've wronged, we want to know about it. But then after the report was published, he gave a retraction, which was a non-apology, which is probably for legal reasons. But he said, essentially, if we've underserved you in any way, then we're sorry. And if and that, which is a complete non-apology. And you're right. If they would just do the right thing, you're right. A lot of these documentaries would go away. But the good part about them not apologizing is that now the really dark, deep, bad stories are coming out. And without these surface ones, I consider what happened to me just very surface level. All abuse is abuse, but the really deep stuff now is coming out because the people on the surface level maybe have talked. And so it needs to come out. And boy, stuff's coming out now. And I'm finding out that at that church still, the church that's abandoned my parents, that's has these high morals, they are paying a person who's a predator and who's assaulted 6 people that I know personally. And he's on the staff there, and they know about it because the law has been involved, but no charges. And they don't care. They don't care. They're upset that somebody didn't wear a hat to church.
Yeah, and like that is the thing that is just I still like trying to grapple with is focus on these rules, but here you say they know they have a predator in their church.
That's right.
Like
But they
make it
believe
make
him over
sense.
all these other girls. They believe him over all these other girls.
Oh
But we don't even know. We don't even know. And I think the most disappointing thing for me right now is I know so many pastors and missionaries that were traveled on mission team with me, or I know them. They're friends with, some of them are friends with me on social media. I'm not friends with a lot of grads anymore, but 10 years ago, the Grace Report came out. I think 4 people in 10 years that are pastors or missionaries from Bob Jones have said, we're sorry what happened. Nobody talks about it. Everybody knows it. And if you corner them on it, they'll be like, yeah, you're right. It was wrong. But then nothing changes and nothing happens. And I think I'm really disappointed that all these pastors and missionary people, no one is taking up this cause. Again, a few have. My pastor's been wonderful. We have a really good, Jason's best friend is a pastor, and he's been really kind, and a couple others. But by and large, they're all silent on this issue. And now they have girls in college down there, and girls are sitting next to a predator in that church. I can't
my.
believe that it's
Could you
not
say
important.
could you say which Bob Jones church this is?
It's Mount Calvary Baptist Church. And it's the only church that I was heavily involved with. So I know a lot more about that church than others, but I have friends who have the same stories. There's just been more and more coming out because people have heard the podcast and they message me. More and more people I'm hearing about just heartbreaking things just since this summer that I had no idea was going on. And a lot of them at that church. And again, they think that it is so safe. There's a guy who's obnoxious grad and involved in politics. He really went after the Grace Report interviewees around the time it came out, saying, there is no safer campus on earth. This is the safest place on earth. And these people really believe that. I guess it's brainwashing. They really believe that their daughter is safe there. And these predators, they're there. They're there. They're still there.
And I'm curious if you have time to dig into a little bit. This might be off topic, but I'm curious about some of the things that you saw in this church, Mount Calvary, growing up, really just looking back. I know you had mentioned church discipline was something. Could you explain that in that church?
So nothing is more terrifying than burning in hell for eternity, or having your loved ones burn in hell for eternity. And that's always at the forefront of your mind. One of your podcast series had, we believe in the inspiration of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. It was something we quoted. And then Dr. Bob III made us quote in chapel in the late 90s. He would say, the most sobering reality in the world today is that. And then we all had to chant that people are dying and going to hell today. Real deadpan. And so that fear of being, what if they're right and you're wrong, is always there. And I remember a lot of kids make a profession around 5 or 6, 7 years old. If you're past 7 years old, it's like, why have you not been saved or baptized yet? Some kids are 2 and 3 and they're making professions of faith about an eternal God, which I don't know. God, I believe that God is all powerful and can do whatever, but it's like this moment in time where you say the sinner's prayer. So they have these camps, and these Farm Fest was the name of one of them. And our youth group would go, and a lot of Bob Jones, it was run by Bob Jones people. And that's where the bluegrass gate started. They would play bluegrass, which was like the one time we could listen to something that had a beat besides Sousa. And this one preacher was notorious for he wanted numbers, who came forward to the altar call and who got saved. So they would tell these horrific stories in chapel and camps about people dying and feeling the flames of hell before they even died. I mean, that was an extreme one, but somebody did do that in chapel. In fact, in FMA once, a chapel preacher, I don't know how he got on the roster, but there was a lot of politics about who could speak in chapel and who couldn't. But this kind of hellfire brimstone old guy, he started talking about some trucker, a semi-truck that was in a terrible crash, and he was trapped in there, and he was on fire, and he was yelling that he could feel the flames of hell or something. And he also talked about kicking a football and doing something with his toenail. It was graphic. And all of a sudden, I was sitting in the sin section, which was like the yellow section, which is way up front. And the rumor was, like, if you were a bad kid, your chapel seat was closer to the front. And I was up there, and it's a hard concrete floor with just that industrial thin layer of carpet. And this guy's talking about burning in hell and losing a toenail. And all of a sudden, I hear thunk. And this girl sitting on the end passed out in chapel. I mean, passed out. And her head hit the concrete. And everyone was like, and the guys, look at eyes up here. We're college kids. And everyone's like, and the ushers come running down. And the funny thing is, they didn't know how to carry her modestly in her skirt. And she's passed out cold. So they're like, where do we grab her? Where do we touch her? There are two of them. One of them came down and just took her shoes off, and then came back and walked her shoes out. And the guy's like, eyes up here. So as a child in middle school, I was terrified when we go to these things. And it's funny because the same kids would go forward every time to get saved. And so this one guy was notorious for preaching these scary ones, and then going to the next and said, I had 100 kids get saved the last time I was here. So there was a numbers game involved. He preached this message. I was in 7th grade. I remember it was yesterday, that in his church, this girl in the youth group, she would come forward every altar call, and she would pray the same prayer. She would say, God, if I'm not saved, please save me. Something I had done many times in my childhood, like cold sweats at night done. And he said, and it wasn't until she said, Lord, I'm not saved, save me. It wasn't until then that she was truly saved. And I'm sitting on a hay bale going, oh no, I'm not saved. I'm going to burn in hell forever. I didn't sleep for a few nights. I had cold sweats. Like I was terrified. And so they scare you with that. So these camps and these scare altar calls, they keep you there because, again, even as an adult leaving the movement, I was afraid for a while that, like, what if I made a mistake for Gracie? What if she goes to hell? Because they have the truth, and only they have the truth. And that's what most cults say, is this is the way. And there's always that little nagging, or for a long time, I've had that nagging of, but what if they were right? So yeah, and that church, they had church discipline. And that was the other thing that was as scary as burning in hell forever. It was this public shaming, because it meant that your fruits didn't match a saved person's fruits. And so if you were church disciplined, you were publicly humiliated, kicked out of the church, and then you probably were going to hell because you didn't have the proper fruits of the Spirit. So they would make a public shaming of people, and they would tell what the sin was, and kids were in the meetings most of the time, and they would give the person a chance to apologize. And if they didn't apologize, they would say, we are not to fellowship with this person, because that's the kindest thing we can do, which is bring them back. Like the Amish, it's shunning is all it is. And we were shunned by people here in Ohio when we finally left the church we were at that was affiliated with Bob Jones. And some of those people still shun us. But Mount Calvary was very big on that kind of a thing. In fact, if you're an elder or deacon, you have to answer to the pastor. If you have a child who's gone astray, some of those men still ask the pastor for permission to talk to their own children who are grown adults, because you shun people to help bring them to Christ.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Don't remember Jesus saying anything about that.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
Right.
Wow. And what were some other memories from this church growing up?
I'm trying to think of other stories. I think something my mom actually would point it out to me about Mount Calvary was when they started, they built the church in a really bad section of South Carolina on purpose because they wanted to minister to the community. I remember over the years, everyone's dressed to the nines in skirts down to their ankles. In fact, at Bob Jones, you're allowed to wear skirts to the bottom of the knee. But like when I would get skirts like that, I couldn't wear them to Mount Calvary because that was showing too much leg. They were more conservative than Bob Jones. I remember only a handful of visitors from the community ever walking in because they stuck out like a sore thumb. Like they didn't fit in. They didn't have a hat on. One time in college, some man off the streets came in and the pastor got up to say something and he said, "And Jesus is coming." And this man yells, "But when is he coming?" And it was dead silent. Nobody did that. Dead silent. And he ignored it and he kept going. And the man yells again, "But when is he coming?" And he was like, "Sir, if you would like to talk to me, I'll talk to you after the service." This is in front of 500 people. Then the ushers come and like physically take his arms and get him out. So they didn't, when I was there, they did not have any good kind of ministry in the community. Later, by the time I graduated, they had a different church down the hill in the old building where that's where visitors could go or people who spoke Spanish. So it was separate from the people here. And I remember once we did a joint youth group with some kids from the community and we cleaned up a creek. In fact, someone I know got bit by a water moccasin and almost lost part of a finger. I remember we did this cleanup with some of the kids in the community, and then we were to come in and listen to a sermon, of course. So this was all about listening to a sermon and getting saved. But the women in the church were upset that they might be muddy, the kids. And so they put down trash bags on the floor and the pews. So they made kids from the community sit on trash bags to not hurt the carpet of the pew. So it's such a juxtaposition of this high church in this poor community. And when I was there, I've never saw anything like, we had to go on visitation, which is a term for embarrassing youth. Basically, you would pair up, guy and a girl, and go into these at Mount Calvary rough neighborhoods, and you would have a tract and you would have something to say. And it was so humiliating. You'd knock on the door and people are like, "What?" And you're in your teens and you're like, "I just had some good news," or whatever. They'd give you a catch line and they'd be like, "Okay, bye." And that was the extent of our community activity. It's just funny because they preach very long, very complicated. I never really understood the sermons. Also, I have ADD. So in my head, I would plan out like theater shows or whatever. But no one off the streets could get anything from what's happening there. And it's sad. It's sad because Bob Jones does the same thing. They keep you so busy with Sunday school, Sunday morning, choir rehearsal, Sunday night, Wednesday night. You're so busy that you're not doing anything in the community. In fact, 2 stories about the church up here in Ohio.
And what's the church called?
Calvary Bible Church.
Okay.
And there are a couple there's Westerville Bible up here, and there's a Berean, who are all still very closely affiliated with Bob Jones. But when we had an interim pastor for a little while there, I had a friend from the community who I met him in community theater. He was a painter and he was such a nice guy. He was rough, he had a mullet, and he was a painter. He was a hardworking, middle, lower class guy and super nice guy. We did Shakespeare plays together in the community. He said, "What church do you go to?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that was a great thing. Inviting people to church was definitely like good job." And so he started coming to church, and it makes me sad. He passed away very suddenly years after this, but he came to church frequently, and he went to Goodwill and bought a suit, and it didn't fit very well, but he saw that everyone there wore suits and ties at all times. Women wore dress. I know that it's lax now, but that's, again, we've had conversations before about how it's not about the rules. That's not the problem, because the rules have been laxed, and here all this stuff is still happening. It's the same. So he would come and sit on the front row, and about his I don't know, sixth time, seventh time coming, somebody in the church told him he needed to pull his pants up, get a haircut, and something else. And he never came back. And then he passed suddenly. And it was really sad because we had a service for him outdoors with all his theater friends. And I thought, this could have been in that church. Like, you want to witness to the community, be nice to people, and have a funeral at the church. And it didn't make sense to me that it really hurt. It was hurtful that they did that to him. And he bought a suit to come because he was trying to fit in. But it's really hard to fit in those circles. You can spot someone a mile away that's not perfectly tailored to the Bob Jones look. And that church up here, it was especially when we were there, very like, you dress to the nines. And then again, when we had an interim pastor, I had a neighbor whose wife took her own life, had 3 small children, our immediate neighbor. And we were so busy with the church and the school that I had guilt about not helping my neighbor. And I could see he was depressed. I could see he was struggling. So I asked him, how can we help? I'm going to get a group of some of our friends from church. How can we help you? And he's, okay, it would really help if someone would clean my gutters and rent a carpet cleaner. I'm buried. I said, that's easy. Yes, we'll do that. So I went to the interim pastor. We were in between pastors, which is a long story. And I was told, he said, now, has he visited our church? And I said, no, he hasn't visited, but his kids have come to some of our whatever. He goes, yeah, I'm going to say he's going to have to visit a couple times at least before we can do that. And I'm like, what? You're keeping me so busy. I can't do this for my literal neighbor. And I know that's not what scripture means when it says neighbor, but he was my literal neighbor. And I was so busy, I couldn't help him. And when I asked the church for one Saturday, half a day, no, they weren't going to give that. Same church used to have a policy with a new pastor, and they're on a bus line. And they had a policy that if a homeless person rang the doorbell, you ignore it, because it would happen when I was there. And that was a policy, you ignore it. I naively came up with this plan of maybe we could have a New Testament and a bottle of water and hand wipes and this was 17 years ago or 16 years ago. And I said, maybe, and there could be a sign out sheet. We have to see your license and you can only do it once a month or whatever. But I was like, I'll donate the whatever. They had session members. They have session members, not elders. He literally laughed. He's like, yeah, that's not going to fly. That'll never happen. So the whole idea was shut down. But this idea of so many of those churches, and Bob Jones leads by example. They don't really get down and dirty in like community. They might go to a soup kitchen or what, but like their time is spent with these highfalutin messages about what the Greek means. And it doesn't match what people need. It's not meeting people's needs. And they'll throw in something that looks good, but if you dig, it's just so surface level. Again, I'm like, why? What is the point of all this high church stuff? If a person can't get help from a church, like, where are they going to go?
Yeah.
And to be right on the bus, people will tell you now that those things have changed. But again, the culture is still very much there. You don't question leadership. You shun people who leave, and you never apologize. So.
For the last question of this interview, I'm curious, what advice would you give to someone who's currently trapped at Bob Jones University or in a Bob Jones church or affiliated organization?
I would say I understand. I fully understand, and I empathize with those who are afraid to leave. It's a big leap. It's scary. You see what happens to everyone else when they leave. It was one of the most painful things that ever happened when we were essentially shoved out. And it was devastating at the time. It was devastating. But looking back, it was like pulling a splinter out. It was the best thing that ever happened to Jason or me. And we just celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary. Obviously, no one is perfect, but the doors and the opportunities that have opened up for both of us, it would never have happened if we had stayed in those tight circles that just chew your time up with stuff that is not bettering the kingdom, and it's not about eternity. And I've been able to do some really interesting like community things and get and get down and dirty and really learn about how the rest of the world actually lives and help people. And they've helped me. And you feel like there's going to be no support, but there are so many people on the other side. And with these podcasts, there's a lot of different people you can contact. There's a lot of people now that can help you with the transition. And you will be amazed at how your own community that has no concept of what Bob Jones is, how those people will be able to help you. My neighbors here, they're some of my closest friends, and they help me. They help my daughter. We have a community, and that's what life is about. It's about connecting with people outside of your small bubble. And it's just, I know that you probably think you are, but it's almost impossible to do that when your time is chewed up with every minute is so busy. So I would say it's getting easier and easier to connect with people because more and more people are coming out and speaking and saying, yes, the same thing happened to me. And you can do this. And it is better. It's better on the other side.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that would be such an encouragement to a lot of people because I'm sure there are people who are listening who feel trapped and don't know what to do and are so dependent on that system. But thank you so much for taking the time to come back on and be on the second podcast and share other stories and things that you had experienced. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to me ramble for a while.
And for people listening, please leave a 5-star rating to help other people find the show. But this is Andrew Pledger, and this was Beyond BJU. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. If you are listening on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, if you could leave a 5-star rating, this will help other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.